Sure, great to hear both of you. And I know you have some questions still too, Ed, but thanks so much, Mark. It's great to hear it's encouraging to hear that we're headed in a solution based discussion and action. So we do have some questions. First one being one of our participants would like to ask you if there are ways for renewable energy sources or biofuels to replace how oil is used in the production of things like plastic or asphalts.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the technologies that we're invested in is a company called LanzaTech, and even like carbon engineering in our clean tech sector in Canada. Basically, the idea is around taking CO2 emissions. Carbon engineering literally takes fresh air and keeps concentrating the carbon in it until it gets down to a CO2 stream. Once you get to CO2, we can actually infuse hydrogen to make fuels. We can actually make feedstocks for petrochemical facilities. We could feed it into textiles. So there's an enormous opportunity around doing it a little differently. Biofuels is kind of an interesting one. It can help us in driving down our overall emissions. I kind of chuckle a little bit because we have the largest ethanol plant in the country. This was built almost 20 years ago, if I'm remembering my dates right. It has the highest carbon content per unit per barrel of energy that we produce as a company today, far higher than oil sands. But the benefit really shows up in the transportation side when it's burned as gasoline in the tank. But we're also involved with a little company that's converting Enerchem in Quebec, that's converting municipal garbage through to ethanol. We've blended now 1 million liters of garbage-based ethanol into our gasoline pool in Western Canada for distribution across Western Canada. So there's some really interesting ideas that can make a huge difference in driving it through. This Enerchem-based fuel that we're making has a negative carbon emission because if you leave it in the garbage facility in Edmonton, it actually emits methane, which affects our climate. So there's really interesting ideas, some of it agricultural based, some of it fats based, some of it is CO2 based.
That's great. Another question for you. In terms of carbon economy, would there be commitment to make compensate farmers for their carbon they capture?
Yeah, I think one of the great opportunities is for us to facilitate kind of this carbon economy within the country. We tried to do a deal many years ago when we were building our Fort Hills project to actually make a contribution to a carbon reduction initiative in another part of the country. Right now, we can't move these carbon credits and such around the country. I think that's a barrier to us moving forward. But one of the really interesting ones that I've heard of in the last 6 months or so is there's not only can they generate credits within farming, but there's different techniques where we may be able to increase the carbon in the soil. Essentially, a lot of our farming techniques over the last 100 years have reduced the carbon content in the soil. So I think that's a really interesting one. And it could be something that actually creates an economic gain for our farmers, which would be great.
Yeah. Maybe more of a more general question. You know, you've been response to so many of Ed's questions as well. So specific on different solutions and technological options that we have moving forward. You know, in French we say that there's oftentimes a dialogue de sourds. We feel like, what are the ways, or do you think that we can just do better at hearing each other more on solutions in terms of the needs of the energy sector, as well as our goals in terms of reducing climate emissions?
Yeah, that's actually a great question because often this has got so polarized in this entire conversation that it's difficult to hear each other. One of the great opportunities is to get through the rhetoric and the demonization into, well, what's the solution space? And then how do we work forward? Like the example Ed gave of $12 billion to be able to invest in these solutions to move forward. Right now, the gasoline tax in Canada, when you look at the retail pump or through to the rack is we're collecting about $17 billion a year just on gasoline fees associated with it. So some of this is like, okay, so instead of just assuming that everybody that works in oil and gas doesn't have a clue and they're just trying to pollute the environment, it's kind of like, no, actually, some of the people are, and I would say generally as an industry, are hardcore in trying to figure out how do we find real solutions. But the coming together, and it's like your question about agriculture is a really interesting one, because it's kind of like, okay, we need to bring groups that don't normally deal with each other. Normally, when we're dealing with agriculture, we're selling fuel. But now it's a totally different conversation, and I think it can be facilitated through organizations or associations for the industries or companies, or through the governments associated with it. And I think trying to find the solution space and have those real conversations, because I think for Canada in particular, with all these natural advantages, we can find amazing solutions that are great for the climate as well as for our economy.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Ed, did you want to jump in there? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in on one question. You know, earlier in the conversation, you were talking about in the United States a system where they create incentives, and then you referred to Alberta having had a carbon pricing system, you know, longer than anybody. Now there's a national one as well. How important do you think carbon pricing and the continuation and perhaps the increase in a carbon price is to unlocking a lot of this potential that you talk about, to creating the incentives to move ahead?
Yeah, the thing about whether it's an incentive or a disincentive, so a carbon price creates to some degree a disincentive, or you can incent people to do things like the 45Q regulations in the United States. The nice thing about it is when you put a price on it, then markets can work, right? And people start going, hey, I can come with this solution. And you kind of go, okay, great, but why would I do that solution when I can get twice as much for half the cost with this other solution? So the joy of it is, to some degree, the price becomes a yardstick in which we can measure the efficiency and effectiveness of each and every solution that comes forward. But I run a company that competes in the international markets. Prices send significant signals. It affects our behavior. And I think that the price, both the price on carbon as well as the incentive side associated with it, can be fabulous levers in being able to bring people together to find solutions and move things forward. The oil industry in Canada since 2007 has made great progress in driving down our emissions. But we call it an intensity benefit because we've grown so much since that period of time that total emissions have gone up. Obviously, we need to do better than this, and we need to go faster.
Well, that's a very critical point and a very interesting point, because the industry has measured its progress by intensity reductions, which I'll do my best to explain this to people, which is basically for every barrel of oil, how much is being emitted. But if you're adding more barrels, because there's more demand in the world for those barrels, then of course your absolute number will go up even as your intensity is going down. But you're saying, and I think this is a key point for confidence, I guess, from other parts of the country, from Canadians generally, that you think you will have to start bending that absolute curve downwards. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, for the country to get to net zero, we have a long ways to go. We emit just over 700 megatons of carbon today. The question is, well, what are we going to do to either reduce it in absolute terms or offset it, which is the whole concept of net, right? Is there something I can do to increase the absorption of carbon from trees that will have a material effect on us getting to net zero? But it's the only way we can do it.
Amazing. So I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that, you know, global emissions have only gone down by 8% in this pandemic, giving so many people being at home, driving less, flying not at all. Yet we're only at 8%. I mean, you've talked a lot about the different efforts made by the industry, but where should we be focusing right now in terms of getting, as you say, a bang for our buck and reducing our emissions?
Right. I don't think it takes a lot to recognize that if we were trying to solve this problem and could control everything on the globe, so it'll show you how like unrealistic my thinking is. But what you would try and figure out is, look, if I was going to invest $1, where do I get the biggest reduction globally for the $1? Because if I go there, I'm going to have the biggest impact. And then the issue with it is, okay, well, then the next dollar, where could I go to have the biggest impact? The unfortunate thing is often what's happened in the enthusiasm to be able to make the biggest impact, we just keep drawing the box smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And now it's like, well, fix this within here. And you think, okay, but it's going to cost me 5 times as much to fix it in this little circle than if I went somewhere else on the globe. This is a global challenge associated with it. I do think that with COVID and this massive isolation that people have had and staying at home, people are starting to realize, okay, this is an incredibly challenging problem that we have. If people had stayed home and carbon emissions had dropped by 85%, they'd go, okay, well, I get it. Let's all go buy an electric car and we're done. But obviously, this is way more complicated than that. And it's one of the challenges around how to solve this. And it literally will take us decades to get to net neutral.
Well, so we're running out of time, but I'm going to let you add. I could see you wanting to ask another question there before we.
I'm going to ask my last question, and I'm just following up on what Mark said. And thank you, Yolande, for being so indulgent of me, because I never run out of questions. As I'm trying to figure out the world, and I never sort of get even close to having it figured out. You know, what you say about the boxes and the smaller circles is interesting, and you know, Canada tried to put into the Paris Agreement, and it's still a live issue, an Article 6. And Article 6 would give credit to countries that export lower intensity products to the world. So LNG Canada being built in Kitimat is supposed to be the cleanest liquefied natural gas production in the world. And if it pushes out coal in China, then that will be good for the world. It will be fewer emissions, and it will be good for Canada because Canada will export and create jobs in Kitimat, many of them Indigenous jobs. But I don't think we're getting to an Article 6. So how do you see us rectifying this problem and treating it as global emissions and trying to, you know, get at the softest spots, the weakest points?
Yeah, great question. We've gone back and looked at the emissions in Canada because the Paris Agreement is based on what you produce. It's not based on your consumption, right? They had to have a window and they decided to pick that. For Canada, this is a real challenge because, like I said, 50% of our exports are from the resource sector. So when we went and looked at it, we've done some work on the side, and I'm not here to say that this is fully accurate and vetted. We've just been trying to understand how much of our greenhouse gas emissions are linked to what we're exporting to other countries. And the number that we calculated on that is 45% of our emissions in the country is related to our exports. So it's kind of like, okay, so how do we cut our emissions in half? Stop exporting everything out of Canada. Obviously, this is a disaster for our economy, but it gives you a sense of the significance of it. And so to some degree, we're exporting a lot of energy. That energy is going to other countries. We're counting their emissions for the production of the energy that they're consuming. So to me, in my simple logic, it would make sense that, okay, well, why don't we go and work with their economies to try and find out how we could drive down emissions because to offset not just the emissions that they have from the product, but also the production that's happening in our country. I think Article 6 is hugely important to the Canadian economy for all these reasons. And I also think if we should have an Article 6 in Canada that allows us to figure out where's the most efficient place to drive down carbon within Canada and have people contribute resources to it and then do the most efficient and effective projects so that we can take those credits back to wherever in the country. When we collectively go on this journey, we will move faster, we'll drive down our emissions faster, and our economy will be stronger.
Well, Mark, we have a lot yet to figure out, but I think we made some progress today. So on behalf of me, before I'll turn it over to Yolande, but thank you so much for being with us at the Public Policy Forum Growth Summit today.
Thanks, Ed.
I couldn't say it better. Thanks so much to both of you, to Mark Little and Ed Greenspan for that great discussion. As well, let me take this chance to also thank our lead partners, CIBC and Microsoft, as well as our supporting partners, once again, Business Development Bank of Canada, Bell, Canadian Bankers Association, Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, Canada Pension Plan Investments, Deloitte, the National Public Relations, and the Globe and Mail. So I'm sure you enjoyed this chat, and I hope you'll join us tomorrow as well on November 10th from 2 to 3:30. There'll be a 90-minute session on Northern innovation featuring the panel of innovative business and community leaders from across the Canadian North. So I'd invite you to check out the virtual exhibit hall before and after tomorrow's session, that you can meet and chat and learn from the Northern innovators. And I do hope to see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Thanks again, and I'll remind you one last thing, check the feed loop and the PPF website for all the latest Rebuild Canada's Growth Summit updates. On that note, see you tomorrow. Have a great rest of the day, everyone.